The sky was painted in hues of orange and red as the sun dipped below the tree line. Alex squinted at the narrow gravel road ahead, gripping the steering wheel with one hand while his other tapped the side of his phone in frustration. The GPS signal had vanished over 20 minutes ago, leaving him with only the vague directions his employer had sent in an email. Turn left at the old oak and keep going until the road stops. He glanced at the looming trees that crowded the road, their gnarled branches arching overhead like claws. The endless stretch of forest was both suffocating and hypnotic. Alex muttered to himself, "This better pay well," though a knot of unease had already begun to form in his stomach. The road finally ended at a small clearing. Nestled in the center was the cabin, an old two-story structure with dark wooden walls that seemed to absorb the fading light. The windows reflected the dim glow of the sunset, but the rest of the cabin appeared eerily lifeless. As Alex parked and stepped out of his car, he was struck by the unnatural silence. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just a heavy, oppressive stillness that made his ears ring. His gaze fell on a note taped crookedly to the cabin door. Its edges were yellowed, and the bold, scrawled letters seemed to drip menace. "Follow the rules, or you won't make it to sunrise." Alex chuckled nervously, trying to dismiss the chill that ran down his spine. "Weird way to welcome someone," he muttered. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the note wasn't a joke. He read it again, slower this time, before noticing something in his peripheral vision. A shadow darting between the trees. He spun around, scanning the forest edge. Nothing. Just rows of unyielding trunks and the faint outline of the setting sun beyond. His heart quickened, but he forced himself to look away. "Get a grip, man. Just the wind or a deer, maybe," he reassured himself, though the excuse felt hollow. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit and smelled faintly of mildew. Alex flicked on the lights, which buzzed and flickered before casting a weak glow over the room. The furniture was sparse and worn, a sagging couch, a battered wooden table, and a faded rug that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in decades. But it wasn't the furniture that caught his attention. Scratches, deep and jagged, marred the wooden walls. They crisscrossed randomly, as though made by something large and angry. He ran his fingers over one of the marks, the edges splintered and sharp. "Wild animals," he whispered, though the scratches didn't look like they came from claws. They were too deliberate, too purposeful. Alex's unease deepened. The oppressive silence of the forest outside seemed to seep into the cabin, wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. He glanced at the note he'd brought inside and set it on the table. The bold words stared back at him. "Follow the rules." As dusk gave way to night, Alex locked the door, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Alex couldn't shake the note's words. "Follow the rules or you won't make it to sunrise." They lingered in his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch, gnawing at his sense of reason. As he unpacked his bag and attempted to settle in, his eyes kept darting toward the kitchen table, where the note rested. It felt alive, as though it were watching him, waiting for him to acknowledge its significance. His curiosity finally got the better of him. He walked back to the table, sighing heavily as he sat down. Beneath the note was another piece of paper, a laminated list of rules, worn and slightly frayed at the edges. The heading was simple but ominous: Cabin Rules. Below it, a numbered list was printed in blocky, uneven text. Number 1, lock the door before sundown. Number 2, do not leave the cabin after midnight. Number 3, if you hear knocking, do not open the door. Number 4, avoid looking into the mirror after 3 a.m. Number 5, never speak to anyone who stands outside the window. Alex's brow furrowed as he reread the list. It was absurd, like something out of a campfire ghost story. "What is this? Some kind of sick joke?" he muttered under his breath. He flipped the laminated sheet over, and his stomach twisted when he saw what was scribbled on the back. "They know when you break them." The words, written in what looked like smudged charcoal, were crude and uneven, as if done in a hurry. For a moment, Alex debated leaving. The money wasn't that good, was it? But the thought of explaining his sudden departure to his employer, and the reality of being broke, kept him rooted in place. Shaking his head, he leaned back in the creaking wooden chair. "Rules," he scoffed. "Fine. Whatever. I'll play along." As the hours ticked by, Alex busied himself exploring the cabin. He opened cupboards and drawers, finding only cobwebs and a few outdated canned goods. The fridge hummed faintly, its shelves mostly empty, except for a bottle of water and a carton of eggs. But the scratches on the walls kept drawing his attention. They were everywhere, long, jagged marks that seemed to spiral in chaotic patterns. Alex ran his hand along the gouges, his skin prickling. No animal he knew could do this. Just as he was about to shrug it off, a faint noise broke the oppressive silence. It was a whisper, soft, unintelligible, but unmistakable. Alex froze, his ears straining to catch the sound again. Nothing. Only the hum of the fridge and the faint creak of the cabin settling. Great, he muttered, trying to shake off the creeping dread. This place is just messing with my head. He decided to test one of the rules, not out of defiance, but curiosity. Alex stepped into the small, outdated bathroom and flicked on the light. A rust-speckled mirror hung above the sink, its surface cloudy with age. He stared at his reflection, studying the tired lines under his eyes. "It's just a mirror," he said aloud, his voice echoing slightly in the cramped space. "Why would I—" His reflection blinked. Alex hadn't. The hair on his arm stood on end as he stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. The mirror was still now, showing only his pale, wide-eyed face. He wanted to dismiss it as a trick of the light, but something about the moment felt wrong. Alex decided to lock the door, following at least one of the rules. As he slid the bolt into place, he noticed the faint sound of rustling outside. He peeked through the window, but all he could see were the dark silhouettes of trees swaying gently in the wind. Still, the sense of being watched persisted. It was as though the cabin itself had eyes, observing his every move, waiting for him to make a mistake. When Alex finally lay down in bed, he found it impossible to sleep. The mattress was lumpy, the air was thick with humidity, and the cabin creaked with every gust of wind. But what truly kept him awake was the whispering. It started softly, barely audible, a rhythmic rise and fall that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Alex pressed his ear against the wooden paneling, holding his breath. "Leave. Before. Too. Late." The words were faint, stretched thin like an old tape recording, but clear enough to send a shiver down his spine. Heart pounding, Alex grabbed the laminated rules from the table and read them again. This time, they didn't seem absurd. They felt like a warning, one he might be too late to heed. The night crept in faster than Alex expected, wrapping the cabin in an oppressive darkness. The forest beyond the windows was a void, its edges indistinguishable from the sky. He made sure the door was bolted, every window latched securely. The rules were simple enough, even if they made no sense, but he wasn't about to tempt fate, not after the mirror incident. His phone displayed 11:47 p.m. The glow from the screen was a small comfort in the otherwise pitch-black room. The cabin was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Alex lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling. He kept the lights on, unwilling to let the darkness fully consume the space. He had tried to sleep earlier, but every creak of the wooden floorboards beneath the cabin seemed amplified. Every gust of wind outside felt like it carried something sinister. At exactly midnight, the first knock came. It was soft, almost tentative, as if someone outside was unsure about being heard. Alex bolted upright, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. The sound came again, 3 light taps, spaced evenly apart. He sat frozen, clutching his phone like a lifeline. His mind raced. It could be an animal, maybe even the wind knocking a branch against the door. But deep down he knew better. The knocking stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt heavier than the darkness itself. Alex forced himself to breathe, repeating the rules in his mind. If you hear knocking, do not open the door. He stayed where he was, his eyes fixed on the door as though staring at it could keep whatever was outside at bay. Minutes passed. Then, without warning, the knocking resumed. Louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't just at the door. It echoed faintly from the windows as though multiple hands were rapping on the glass in unison. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe. Alex's phone screen dimmed, and for a brief moment he swore he saw his reflection in the darkened surface staring back at him, smiling faintly. He shook his head and looked away, his focus snapping back to the windows. The curtains swayed slightly, though the air inside was still. He could hear something else now. Faint whispers threading through the knocking, voices that didn't belong to anything human. They were calling his name. He clenched his fists, digging his nails into his palms to stay grounded. The urge to answer, to open the door and make the knocking stop, grew stronger with each passing second. His rational mind screamed at him to stay put. But another part of him, deeper and more primal, wanted to know who or what was out there. He gritted his teeth and turned on his phone's flashlight, pointing it toward the windows. Nothing moved outside, but the whispers grew louder. The knocking ceased again, and Alex dared to hope it was over. He sank back onto the couch, his body trembling with adrenaline. But the silence didn't bring relief. It only sharpened his senses, making him hyper-aware of every shadow in the room. A movement caught his eye. A fleeting, blurry figure passing by the window. He barely had time to register it before it disappeared into the darkness. He grabbed the laminated list of rules from the table and clutched it like a talisman, his hands shaking as he reread them. Then came the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, pacing back and forth outside the cabin. They stopped directly in front of the door. Alex didn't dare to move, barely allowing himself to breathe. Slowly, a shadow appeared beneath the crack of the door, motionless. A moment later, a voice came, muffled but unmistakably clear. "Alex, let me in." His blood ran cold. The voice sounded familiar. Too familiar. It was his mother's voice, warm and comforting, the way she used to sound when he was a child and afraid of the dark. But it wasn't possible. She was miles away, safe in the city. "Alex," the voice repeated, softer this time, almost pleading. "It's me. Let me in." His throat tightened and tears pricked the corners of his eyes. He wanted so badly to believe it was her. The way she spoke, the rhythm of her words, was perfect. But the rules came rushing back to him. Never speak to anyone who stands outside the window. He realized with dawning horror that the voice was coming from the wrong place. It wasn't at the door. It was outside the living room window, just behind the curtains. Alex's breathing grew shallow as he fought the urge to turn his head. He couldn't let it see him, whatever it was. The voice continued, growing softer and more desperate with each plea. "Please, Alex. I'm scared. Let me in." The tone shifted slightly, an undercurrent of malice slipping through the words. It wasn't his mother's voice anymore, not entirely. It was something pretending to be her, something that knew exactly how to twist the knife. The knocking resumed, synchronized with the voice, creating a maddening rhythm that threatened to unravel him. He clutched the rules tighter, his knuckles white, and squeezed his eyes shut. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, the knocking stopped. The voice fell silent. Alex opened his eyes cautiously, his body tense and ready to flee at the slightest sound. The stillness was worse than the noise. He waited, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. When the first rays of dawn finally filtered through the curtains, Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The cabin looked the same as it had the night before, but he knew something had changed. He wasn't alone. Not really. The forest had noticed him, and it wasn't going to let him go easily. Morning arrived with a thin layer of mist curling around the cabin, clinging to the windows like a ghostly veil. Alex hadn't slept, his nerves frayed from the night's relentless torment. His hands trembled as he brewed a weak cup of instant coffee, the motions mechanical and devoid of thought. The eerie stillness of the woods outside felt heavier in the daylight, as though the trees were silently conspiring against him. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent his heart racing. Desperate for answers, Alex began searching the cabin more thoroughly. There had to be a logical explanation, something to ground him and dispel the growing sense of dread. In the small utility closet, he found a pile of old papers and notebooks, most of them covered in mildew and illegible scribbles. One notebook stood out, its leather cover cracked and faded but intact. Inside, the yellowed pages were filled with neat handwriting, dated entries spanning several years. It belonged to a former caretaker. The first entries were mundane, notes about weather, supply deliveries, and maintenance tasks. But as Alex flipped through the pages, the tone grew darker. The caretaker, a man named Daniel, described strange events eerily similar to what Alex had experienced. Whispers in the night, knocking at the door and the overwhelming feeling of being watched. One entry was underlined multiple times. The rules are not suggestions. They are your only defense. Alex's hands tightened around the book as he read on. Daniel recounted how previous caretakers had disappeared, leaving behind nothing but their belongings. Some ignored the rules, dismissing them as superstition, and vanished within days. Others broke them out of fear or desperation, their fates even more gruesome. One story detailed a man who had opened the door after midnight, only for his body to be found days later, twisted and broken as if something had crushed him from the inside. The final entries were the most disturbing. Daniel wrote of shadowy figures that lingered just beyond the tree line during the day, watching silently. He described mirrors showing distorted reflections, faces that didn't belong to him. The last page simply read, "I can't do this anymore. If you're reading this, may God help you." Alex closed the notebook, his mind racing. He felt trapped, the weight of the cabin's rules pressing down on him. He decided to step outside, hoping the fresh air might clear his head. The moment he opened the door, the forest greeted him with an unnatural quiet. There were no birds, no insects, just the faint rustle of the mist moving through the trees. He noticed something carved into the wooden frame of the cabin's entrance. Symbols, crude and jagged, were etched deep into the wood. They resembled the scratches on the walls inside, but arranged in a pattern that felt intentional. Alex traced the lines with his fingers, feeling a strange warmth emanating from them, as though the carvings were alive. The symbols continued on several nearby trees, forming a rough circle around the cabin. He didn't know what they meant, but they filled him with an overwhelming sense of unease. As he wandered further from the cabin, Alex stumbled upon something hidden among the trees, an old weathered shed. Its door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of decay. The shed was filled with tools, most of them rusted and unusable. But what caught Alex's attention was a wooden box tucked in the corner. It was sealed with a heavy padlock, its surface covered in the same strange symbols carved into the cabin. He debated whether to open it, the thought of what might be inside both terrifying and tantalizing. Ultimately, curiosity won. He searched the shed for something to break the lock and found a crowbar among the tools. The metal groaned in protest as he forced the padlock open. Inside the box, wrapped in a thick layer of burlap, was an object that made Alex's stomach churn. A crude wooden mask, its surface warped and painted with red and black patterns. The eyes were hollow, but staring into them felt like staring into something alive. A sudden noise behind him made Alex whip around, his heart leaping into his throat. The door of the shed slammed shut, though there was no wind strong enough to move it. He sprinted back to the cabin, the mask clutched tightly in his hands. Once inside, he bolted the door and threw the mask onto the table. The air felt heavier, charged with a tension he couldn't explain. The mask seemed to pulse faintly, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. Alex returned to the notebook, flipping through the pages again. He found a mention of the mask near the end. It's a warning, or maybe a key, I don't know, but it draws them closer. His hands shook as he reread the line. What had he done? What had he brought into the cabin? The sun began its slow descent, and Alex realized with a sinking feeling that night was coming again. This time, he didn't feel prepared. Something had changed. The cabin no longer felt like a place of refuge, but a trap, its walls pressing in on him, its shadows darker and more alive. He stared at the laminated list of rules, his mind racing with questions. Whatever was in the woods wasn't going to stop. And now, he wasn't sure the rules would be enough to save him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the cabin seemed to exhale, its wooden walls groaning as if preparing for what the night would bring. Alex sat on the couch, the laminated rules in his trembling hands. His eyes darted between the list and the mask on the table, its hollow eyes seemingly fixed on him. The air felt heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on his chest. The silence outside was almost deafening, the stillness unnatural, as if the forest was holding its breath. He tried to focus on the rules, lock the door before sundown. That one was done. He had checked and double-checked every latch, every window. But the rest, he wasn't sure anymore if following them would keep him safe. The mask sat in the dim light of the cabin's single lamp, an object that seemed to throb with its own energy. He had no idea why he'd brought it inside, but now it felt as if the thing was alive, pulling the darkness closer. Midnight approached with agonizing slowness. Alex's phone buzzed faintly on the table, but when he looked at it, there was no signal. The clock on the screen blinked. 11:57 p.m. He stared at it, willing the minutes to pass faster, but the time seemed to crawl. The moment the clock struck 12, the cabin's atmosphere shifted. The first sound came from the kitchen, a faint scratching, like nails raking against wood. Alex froze, every muscle in his body tensed. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, moving along the walls, circling the cabin. It stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural hum that seemed to resonate through the floorboards. He clutched the laminated rules tighter, his knuckles white. Then came the knocking. It was the same as the night before. 3 deliberate, evenly spaced knocks on the door. Alex's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the door, willing himself not to move, not to respond. The knocking came again, louder this time, and then again, until it echoed through the entire cabin. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block it out, but the sound seemed to worm its way into his skull, rattling his thoughts. The whispers began shortly after. They came from everywhere and nowhere at once, threading through the walls, the windows, even the floor beneath him. His name drifted through the air, soft and melodic at first, but the longer it went on, the more distorted it became. The voices shifted, overlapping, their tones guttural and inhuman. Alex gritted his teeth, rocking back and forth on the couch as if movement might somehow drown them out. The knocking stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the silence returned. Alex let out a shaky breath, daring to hope that whatever was outside had gone. But then a new sound emerged, the creak of floorboards from the hallway. His blood turned to ice. Someone or something was inside. He turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. The hallway was shrouded in shadow, but he could see a faint outline at the edge of the light. It was humanoid, its proportions just slightly wrong. Arms too long, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Alex's breath hitched as the figure moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick, and held it out in front of him like a weapon. The figure stopped just outside the light, its face obscured. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then in a voice that didn't belong to anything human, it spoke. "Why did you bring it here?" Alex's knees nearly buckled. The words were low, drawn out, each syllable vibrating with a strange, otherworldly resonance. He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. His voice had abandoned him, swallowed by the fear choking him. The figure tilted its head further, almost curiously, before taking a step back into the shadows and vanishing. He stood frozen, the candlestick still raised, his chest heaving. The whispers resumed, louder this time, a cacophony of voices that seemed to mock him. They came from the mask now, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Alex stumbled back, dropping the candlestick with a loud clatter. The mask shifted. It didn't move physically, but its presence seemed to grow, filling the room with an oppressive energy. The voices poured out of it, incoherent yet commanding, pulling at his mind. He wanted to throw it outside, to destroy it, but something deeper, something primal, kept him rooted in place. Suddenly, the cabin's windows rattled violently, the glass threatening to shatter. Shadows outside writhed like living things, pressing against the panes, their forms shifting and contorting. Alex knew he couldn't stay in the cabin, not with whatever was clawing its way closer. But leaving would break another rule, and he wasn't sure which was worse, staying inside with the mask or stepping out into the darkness. The whispers grew into a roar, drowning out his thoughts, and the mask seemed to pulse with light. As Alex's vision blurred, he realized one horrifying truth. The rules weren't there to protect him. They were there to delay the inevitable. The first thing Alex felt when he opened his eyes was the cold. It crept through the cabin, sharp and biting, as if the very air had turned against him. The lamp on the table flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows that seemed to shift on their own. His head throbbed, and for a moment, he couldn't remember why he was lying on the floor. Then it came back. The mask, the voices, the thing in the hallway. He bolted upright, scanning the room, his heart pounding in his chest. The mask was still on the table, but something about it had changed. Its hollow eyes now burned faintly with a crimson glow, the warped patterns on its surface seeming to ripple like water. The whispers were gone, replaced by an ominous silence that felt alive, pressing against his skin like a tangible weight. He stood slowly, his legs unsteady, and backed away from the mask, his breath shallow and rapid. As he moved, the cabin seemed to respond, its wooden floor groaning louder than it should have, the walls creaking as if under immense strain. He turned toward the windows and his stomach dropped. The forest outside was no longer the same. The trees were closer, their gnarled branches clawing at the glass, and the mist had thickened into an impenetrable white wall. Something moved within it. Shapes, indistinct and writhing, circling the cabin like predators stalking their prey. A faint sound broke the silence, barely audible at first, but growing steadily louder. It was a low, rhythmic thudding, like a heartbeat, echoing through the cabin's walls. Alex's pulse quickened, matching the rhythm as the sound seemed to come from all directions at once. He clutched his head, trying to block it out, but the noise burrowed into his mind, growing more intense with each beat. The laminated list of rules lay crumpled on the floor where he had dropped it. He snatched it up, desperate for guidance, but the words had changed. The letters were smeared and distorted, the once clear instructions now replaced with a single phrase scrawled across the page. "You've broken them all." A chill ran down his spine as the door rattled violently, shaking on its hinges as if something was trying to force its way in. He stumbled back, gripping the edge of the table for support, his eyes darting between the door and the mask. The thudding grew louder, more insistent, and he realized with a sickening dread that it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from beneath the cabin. The floor beneath his feet shuddered, a deep, guttural growl rising from below. He dropped the list and ran to the kitchen, searching frantically for anything that could protect him. His hands found a rusted butcher knife in a drawer, its blade dull but sturdy. He gripped it tightly, the weight of it providing little comfort. The growling intensified, and the floorboards began to warp and splinter, as though something massive was pressing up from below. A loud crash echoed through the cabin as one of the windows shattered, the cold mist pouring in like a living entity. Alex turned to face it, his knife raised, but he froze when he saw what emerged from the mist. It was a figure, human in shape but wrong in every way. Its limbs were elongated and twisted, its face featureless except for two hollow, glowing eyes that burned with the same crimson light as the mask. The figure moved toward him, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Alex backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but the figure didn't stop. It reached out with a hand that ended in long, claw-like fingers, the air around it growing colder with each step. Desperate, Alex grabbed the mask from the table and held it out in front of him like a shield. The figure stopped abruptly, its head tilting as if studying him. For a brief, horrifying moment, Alex thought he saw recognition in its glowing eyes. The whispers returned, low and menacing, spilling out of the mask and filling the room. The figure extended its hand, palm open, as though it were asking for the mask. Alex hesitated, his mind racing. He felt an overwhelming urge to hand it over, to let this thing take it and leave him in peace. But something deep inside him, a primal instinct, screamed that doing so would be a mistake. The mask wasn't just an object, it was a key, a tether to whatever malevolent force controlled this place. The floorboards beneath him groaned loudly, and he realized with mounting terror that the growling from below was now directly under his feet. A sharp crack split the air, and the floor gave way, sending him sprawling onto the ground. He scrambled to his feet, clutching the mask tightly, and bolted toward the door. The figure didn't follow but remained standing in the mist, its glowing eyes watching him as he fumbled with the lock. The door burst open, and Alex stumbled outside into the cold, suffocating mist. The forest loomed around him, its twisted branches forming a maze that seemed to shift and close in on itself. He ran blindly, the mask still clutched to his chest, the whispers now inside his head growing louder with every step. The trees seemed to reach for him, their branches clawing at his clothes, their roots tripping him at every turn. The ground beneath him felt unstable, shifting and pulsing like a living thing. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get as far away from the cabin as possible. But no matter how far he ran, the forest refused to let him go. It closed in tighter, the mist thickening until he could barely see his own hands. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the air, cutting through the whispers like a blade. "You cannot escape." Alex fell to his knees, his strength drained, the mask slipping from his hands. The voice laughed, a sound that reverberated through the trees, mocking and cruel. The ground beneath him opened like a maw, and as he fell into the darkness, he realized the forest had been waiting for him all along. Alex's descent felt endless. The darkness swallowed him whole, thick and suffocating, pressing against his skin like a living entity. The mask slipped from his grasp, tumbling into the void below. His screams were lost in the oppressive silence, absorbed into the abyss. When he finally hit the ground, the impact jarred every bone in his body, leaving him breathless and disoriented. The air down here was colder, damp, and heavy with the scent of earth and decay. He pushed himself up, his limbs trembling, and looked around. The faint glow of crimson light illuminated the space. A cavernous chamber carved from the roots of ancient trees that twisted and writhed as though alive. The walls pulsed faintly, as if the entire place were breathing. In the center of the chamber stood the mask, upright and perfectly still, its hollow eyes burning brighter than ever. It didn't make sense. He had dropped it, hadn't he? A low rumble echoed through the chamber, shaking the ground beneath him. He turned to see shadows emerging from the walls, peeling themselves away like living ink. They had no defined form, their edges constantly shifting and dissolving, but their eyes, those same glowing crimson eyes, stared straight at him. The whispers began again, louder now, their words overlapping and indistinguishable, clawing at his sanity. The mask seemed to respond to the shadows, its glow intensifying. Alex felt a pull, a magnetic force drawing him closer. Against his better judgment, he took a step forward, then another, his body moving as if under someone else's control. The whispers grew sharper, cutting through his thoughts like shards of glass. They weren't just voices. They were memories, fears, regrets, all spilling out at once, paralyzing him. One of the shadows lunged, its form coalescing into a clawed hand that reached for his chest. Alex stumbled back, narrowly avoiding its grasp, and the spell over him broke. He turned to run, but the chamber had no exit. The walls had sealed themselves, the roots twisting into a solid barrier. He was trapped. The ground beneath the mask cracked, splitting open to reveal a pit of seething darkness. From it emerged a figure unlike the others, towering and grotesque. Its body was a patchwork of flesh and shadow, its face hidden beneath a jagged crown of bone. When it spoke, its voice was a cacophony of tones, each one dripping with malice. "You have broken the pact." Alex's mind raced. "What pact?" he shouted, his voice trembling. "I don't know what you're talking about." The figure extended an arm, pointing directly at him. "You ignored the rules. You invited us in. Now you belong to us." The word struck Alex like a physical blow, and he staggered backward. "No," he stammered. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." His excuses sounded hollow even to himself. The rules had been clear, yet he had broken them, each one a small crack that had let the darkness seep in. The figure moved closer, its massive form blocking out the mask's light. Alex dropped to his knees, his body racked with fear and exhaustion. The shadows closed in, their whispers becoming deafening. He clenched his fists, refusing to accept this as the end. There had to be a way out, something he could do to fight back. His gaze fell on the mask, still glowing faintly beneath the towering figure. The journal's words echoed in his mind. It's a warning, or maybe a key. Summoning every ounce of courage, Alex lunged forward, grabbing the mask. The moment his fingers touched it, the chamber shook violently, the shadows recoiling as if burned. The figure roared, its voice shaking the very ground, and Alex pressed the mask to his face. Pain shot through his skull, searing and unbearable, but he didn't let go. The mask fused to his skin, its light pouring out of him in blinding waves. The whispers turned to screams, the shadows writhing and dissipating as the light consumed them. The towering figure lunged, its clawed hand reaching for Alex. But the mask's power surged, forming a barrier of pure light. The figure shrieked, its body unraveling into strands of darkness that were pulled back into the pit. The cavern trembled as the ground beneath Alex cracked and shifted. Just as the chamber began to collapse, Alex felt himself being pulled upward. The darkness receded, the crimson glow fading as the world around him dissolved. He gasped for air, his lungs burning, and when his vision cleared, he found himself lying in the clearing outside the cabin. The mask was gone. The forest was silent, its mist lifted, the oppressive energy replaced by an eerie stillness. Alex staggered to his feet, his body weak and battered. The cabin stood as it had before, its windows dark and lifeless, but it no longer felt like a trap. It was empty, abandoned. Alex didn't wait. He stumbled toward his car, fumbling with the keys as his hands shook. The engine sputtered to life, and he sped down the gravel road, the cabin growing smaller in his rearview mirror. The rules, the shadows, the mask. It all felt like a distant nightmare, but the ache in his chest and the rawness in his mind told him it was real. As he reached the edge of the forest, Alex dared to glance back one last time. The cabin was gone, the clearing now filled with overgrown trees and wildflowers. But deep in the shadows of the woods, he thought he saw something. Two faint, glowing eyes watching him. He didn't stop. The drive back to town was a blur. Alex's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, the hum of the car engine the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. He couldn't bring himself to look in the rearview mirror anymore. The faint memory of those glowing eyes burned into his mind. Every shadow cast by the headlights felt alive. Every curve in the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the unknown. When he finally reached the outskirts of town, the sight of streetlights and the faint hum of life brought a fleeting sense of relief. Yet, the weight in his chest didn't ease. He parked outside a 24-hour diner, the fluorescent sign flickering weakly above the entrance. His legs trembled as he stepped out of the car, the night air cool but carrying an unnatural stillness that made his skin crawl. Inside the diner, the comforting buzz of conversation and the clatter of dishes felt jarring, almost surreal. Alex slumped into a booth at the corner, his eyes darting to the windows, scanning for movement in the darkness outside. A waitress approached, her warm smile faltering as she took in his pale, disheveled appearance. "Rough night?" she asked gently, placing a glass of water in front of him. Alex nodded but said nothing. He sipped the water, the cold liquid doing little to calm the firestorm in his mind. The events of the last few days played on a loop, each moment sharper and more vivid than the last. The mask, the shadows, the figure's haunting words. They all felt too real to ignore. Pulling out his phone, he tried to search for any mention of the cabin, the rules, or even the symbols he'd seen carved into the wood. But no matter what he typed, nothing relevant came up. It was as if the cabin didn't exist, like it had been erased from the world entirely. His frustration mounted, the screen blurring as tears welled in his eyes. He blinked them away, gripping the phone tightly, his knuckles aching. A shadow passed by the window, and Alex froze, his body stiffening instinctively. He turned his head slowly, heart hammering in his chest, but there was nothing there. The parking lot was empty, the night outside calm and undisturbed. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out hollow and forced. No matter how far he'd driven, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. The waitress returned with a plate of food, setting it down in front of him. "You okay?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost concerned. Alex nodded again, forcing a weak smile. "Yeah, just tired." She lingered for a moment, as if debating whether to press further, but eventually walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He poked at the food, his appetite non-existent, his mind racing. The rules had been clear, and he had broken every one of them. Yet, he was alive. Why? A faint vibration in his pocket jolted him from his thoughts. He pulled out his phone, a wave of unease washing over him as he saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but curiosity, or maybe something deeper, compelled him to answer. "Hello?" His voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. There was no response at first, just a faint static that crackled ominously in his ear. Then a voice spoke, a low, distorted tone that sent chills down his spine. "You think it's over?" Alex's blood ran cold. The voice was familiar, though twisted, like an echo of his own. Before he could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the screen, his hands trembling, the words repeating in his head like a mantra. It wasn't over. It would never be over. He paid for the untouched meal and left the diner, the comforting hum of its lights and chatter fading as he stepped back into the night. The world outside felt wrong, as though the cabin had left a permanent scar on reality. He climbed into his car and drove aimlessly, the road stretching endlessly before him. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. He couldn't tell. The darkness seemed to swallow time itself. When he finally stopped, it was in front of his apartment building, though he didn't remember driving there. The lights in the hallway flickered as he made his way inside, the air heavy and stifling. His apartment felt foreign, unfamiliar, as though it belonged to someone else. The laminated list of rules sat on the kitchen counter, pristine and untarnished, despite having been left behind in the cabin. Alex stared at it, his heart pounding. Slowly he approached and picked it up, his hands shaking. The rules were intact, unchanged, as though mocking him for ever thinking he could escape. From somewhere deep within the apartment, a faint knocking began. Alex froze, the laminated paper slipping from his hands. It landed on the floor with a soft thud, the words staring up at him like a warning carved into his soul. He turned toward the sound, his breath caught in his throat. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the walls. And then from the darkness of his bedroom, a voice called his name. Alex didn't move, couldn't breathe. He stood rooted in place as the knocking stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. "It's your turn to make the rules now." Alex's breath hitched as the voice faded into silence. The stillness that followed was suffocating, heavier than anything he'd felt in the cabin. His legs felt like lead, his body refusing to move despite the primal urge to run. The voice had come from the bedroom, a place he had always associated with safety. Now it felt like a predator's den, waiting to consume him. He forced himself to take a step forward, then another. Each movement felt deliberate, as if the air itself was resisting him. The hallway stretched unnaturally long, shadows shifting along the walls, elongating and curling like tendrils. The knocking hadn't resumed, but its absence was worse. It was as if whatever had made the sound was now waiting, watching. The door to his bedroom stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. Alex's heart hammered in his chest as he reached for the handle, his fingers trembling. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The room was shrouded in shadows, the faint glow of the streetlight outside barely penetrating the thick, oppressive darkness. His eyes scanned the room, searching for the source of the voice. At first he saw nothing, just the familiar outlines of his furniture bathed in eerie half-light. But then he noticed the mirror. It hung on the far wall, its surface polished to a faultless sheen, reflecting the dim light with unsettling clarity. Something about it drew his gaze, a magnetic pull he couldn't resist. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't quite right. The face in the glass smiled faintly, though his lips hadn't moved. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he stepped closer, his feet moving of their own accord. The reflection's smile widened, stretching unnaturally, splitting his face into a grotesque grin. Alex stopped, his breath shallow, the air around him feeling colder with each second. The reflection tilted its head, studying him, its eyes gleaming with a faint crimson light. "You brought it here," the reflection said, its voice a distorted version of his own. "You opened the door." Alex shook his head, backing away from the mirror. "I didn't mean to," he stammered. "I didn't know." "You knew," the reflection interrupted, its grin fading into a look of pure malice. "You just didn't care." The shadows in the room began to move, swirling around the mirror like a living fog. They crept along the floor and walls, their tendrils reaching toward Alex. He stumbled back, but the shadows closed in, their cold touch sending shivers through his body. The reflection leaned closer to the glass, its voice low and commanding. "You broke the rules. Now you will make them." Alex fell to his knees, clutching his head as the shadows enveloped him. His thoughts fractured, memories of the cabin flashing in his mind. Its walls, the mask, the thing in the hallway. It all led to this moment, this inevitability. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling his ears with a cacophony of commands and accusations. The mirror began to ripple, its surface distorting like water disturbed by an unseen force. Alex looked up, his vision blurred by tears, as the reflection extended its hand out of the glass. The limb was pale and unnatural, its fingers impossibly long, each tipped with sharp black claws. It reached for him, and though every instinct screamed to run, Alex couldn't move. The shadows held him in place, forcing him to watch as the hand drew closer. When it touched his chest, a searing pain erupted, unlike anything he had ever felt. It wasn't physical. It was deeper, as if something inside him was being ripped apart. The room spun, the whispers reaching a deafening crescendo, and then everything went still. The shadows withdrew, the mirror's surface returned to normal, and Alex collapsed to the floor. He woke hours later, the faint glow of dawn spilling through the window. The room was eerily calm, the oppressive energy gone. But something had changed. He felt it in his bones, in the air around him. Rising shakily to his feet, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. His reflection stared back, identical in every way, except for the faint glow in his eyes. Crimson, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. On the dresser lay a piece of paper. It hadn't been there before. Alex picked it up, his hands trembling. The paper was blank except for a single line, scrawled in the same uneven script as the rules from the cabin. Write them well. They will follow. Alex sank onto the edge of the bed, the weight of the words pressing down on him. The rules weren't just for him anymore. They were his to create, his to enforce, and he knew with a sickening certainty that the cycle would continue. Somewhere, someone else would stumble into the woods, drawn to the cabin, and when they did, his rules would be waiting. The days blurred into one another after that night. Alex tried to return to normalcy, but the edges of his reality felt frayed. Every shadow seemed too deep, every sound too sharp, as if the world had shifted ever so slightly. The rules became an obsession. He couldn't stop writing them, filling page after page with instructions, warnings, and contingencies. They poured from him like water through a broken dam, his hand moving across the paper as if guided by something beyond his control. At first, he tried to fight it, to ignore the compulsion. But the whispers would return, faint at first, then louder, insistent until he couldn't bear it anymore. Writing was the only way to silence them, if only temporarily. Each new set of rules was different, tailored for someone else. Someone who hadn't yet arrived, but inevitably would. The laminated list reappeared on his kitchen counter one morning, pristine and untouched despite its journey. Alex stared at it for hours, unable to bring himself to touch it. He knew what it meant, what it symbolized. The cabin hadn't let him go. It had simply moved through him, passed its curse along, and now he was part of it. The rules weren't just his to write. They were his to enforce. One night, the whispers led him back to the forest. He didn't know how he got there, the miles between his apartment and the woods vanishing as if they had never existed. The clearing was unchanged, the cabin standing as though it had been waiting for him all along. He approached it cautiously, the weight of his task pressing down on him. The door creaked open before he could touch it, the darkness inside welcoming him like an old friend. Alex stepped inside, and the mask was there, sitting on the table, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. A new list of rules was beside it, written in his own handwriting, though he didn't remember writing it. He felt a chill run through him as he picked it up and read the words. They weren't for him. They were for the next person. The forest was silent as he emerged from the cabin, the laminated list clutched in his hand. He didn't look back as he walked away, the trees closing in behind him, erasing any trace of the cabin's existence. But he knew it was still there, waiting for the next caretaker, the next victim. Back in his apartment, Alex sat at his desk, the list of rules spread out before him. The whispers were gone, but their absence was heavy, filled with the knowledge of what was to come. He stared at the paper for what felt like hours before pulling out his phone. "If you're reading this," he began, his voice low but steady as he recorded himself, "then you need to understand, the rules are not a game. They're not suggestions. They're the only thing standing between you and what's out there." He paused, his eyes dark, the faint crimson glow flickering within them. "Follow them, or you won't make it to sunrise. If you found this story gripping, share it with someone who loves a good scare. And remember, sometimes rules are written in blood. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chilling tales. Your support keeps these stories alive, and maybe keeps you safe."